I released a video yesterday talking about the Switch 2 and the keycard situation, and it sparked a debate within the comment section where one commenter referred to the Switch as basically a side console to the Wii, and they basically said that it was a console that was meant for children. And this is something that I thought was quite interesting because there are a lot of people, especially people who aren't as pro Nintendo as others, who view most, if not all, Nintendo consoles as consoles that were meant for children. And I think a lot of this comes from what we see in Nintendo's first party games with Super Mario, Zelda, Kirby. With the exception of maybe Metroid, most of the flagship characters in the Nintendo universe do have a very childlike, jovial, um, I guess, innocent type of look to them, to where it wouldn't necessarily attract more of your adult gamer or someone who was looking for something with more M-rated content. Now, I thought that this was interesting when they said that about the Switch because, in my opinion, the Switch has been one of the most ubiquitous consoles that I think Nintendo has ever produced, being that so many games, including games from other consoles, and other console libraries have actually been moved to the Switch. Not only that, there are games that are on the Switch that are third party titles that straight out of the box are very, for lack of better terms, adult like in their themes, in their overtones, and in their content. One game that I could think of that comes to mind immediately is a game called Katana Zero, which on the surface looks like a 2D pixelized, sprite-based game for kids. But once you get into the game, you realize very quickly how mature and how adult that game actually is. And so it had me thinking, how many people actually view Nintendo as a company that makes games for children versus companies like Sony and or Microsoft, who some people might view as more adult companies or companies that make consoles and video games for adults. Is there any truth to this? And does it really matter in the long run when it comes to sales and, how successful a console actually is? So when I started to think about this, I immediately had to think about who is buying video games today and who has historically bought video games. And 9 times out of 10, it's going to be an adult, for the simple fact that most children don't have the means to purchase their own video games. But one of the things that we have seen over time, and something that has increased over time, is adult gaming, where you see more and more adults enjoying playing video games themselves. And not just a situation where you have adults buying video games for children. And of course, this has introduced a whole new type of consumer into the market of video games. And because of this, we're starting to see games produced in a different way. And we're seeing different types of games produced for a more adult consumer. One of the primary examples of this that I can see on the surface is a game like GTA 6, a game that was supposed to have been released this year but has been pulled back and is set to release in 2026. Now, like many of you, I have also seen a lot of the screenshots for what GTA 6 is supposed to look like. And I would have to assume, based on what I've seen from Grand Theft Auto 3, Grand Theft Auto Vice City, San Andreas, 4, 5, that the themes in Grand Theft Auto 6 are going to be somewhat mature. It's probably not going to be a game that I'm going to want my 5-year-old to play, just because of not only the themes, but how realistic they'll be able to make those themes look with the newer technology. And I had to think to myself, is there some credence to that comment? Because I don't know if culturally I've ever seen as much hype and as much excitement around a game like the way I've seen it around GTA 6. Everyone from your preteen all the way up to your adult, regardless of the age, is excited to see what GTA 6 is going to offer. But do adults make up more of the gaming market than children? I still don't believe so, for the main reason being that most of the adults who have the funds to buy these games probably have to go to work. They probably have to obviously do things that take them away from actual gaming. And so they're probably not as engaged in the hobby as, say, children under the age of 18. And so I had to start to think, has Nintendo really pigeonholed themselves into this place where they are just viewed as a company that makes video games for children? And if I'm being honest with myself, I have always considered Nintendo to be the company that kind of makes more of kid-friendly games. Everything from their flagship characters, their flagship games, and even the way they design their consoles has always been very kid friendly. For me, I would go all the way back to the Sega Genesis and the Super Nintendo era, which was really one of the greatest console wars of all time. And I think it was the perfect balance of yin and yang when you compared the Sega Genesis to the Super Nintendo. The Super Nintendo bore a light gray color with purple accents on some of their buttons. The control pad had these, purple and lavender buttons, and it was a mixture of these light and dark grays and purples and lavenders, which don't necessarily scream the most hardcore of systems, juxtaposed against the Sega Genesis, which was an all-black console with red accents, hard lines, and just had more of a darker tone to it. And then when you look at even the games themselves and how the games were presented, Nintendo opted for larger cardboard boxes that displayed large bright graphics, whereas Sega Genesis used more of the dark, hardcore clamshell cases, which were more rough and tough. And then we have to look at the marketing. When you start to look at the way Nintendo advertised their consoles and games versus Sega Genesis, which went for the more, I would say, adult themed type of advertising, kind of highlighting the fact that Sega does what Nintendo don't, having a more gritty and edgy appeal, which probably appealed to more adults. And then even if you look at some of the games that were released on both the Sega Genesis and the Super Nintendo, using Mortal Kombat, for example, the Mortal Kombat game on the Sega Genesis actually showed blood, whereas the Mortal Kombat game on the Super Nintendo didn't show blood. So there was definitely more censorship on Nintendo's part when it came to certain games and it came to certain themes. And if you look even at other consoles on the Sega Genesis, from the Dreamcast to the Sega Saturn, especially the Sega Saturn, when you start to look at some of those import Sega Saturn games, some of those games are it's close. Some of those are borderline M-rated content if you really start to dig through the import Saturn library. And for those who know, if you know, you know, how to the edge Sega went with some of those games. Nevertheless, does that mean that in 2025, the average consumer looks at the Switch as a kid's game or looks at the Switch as something only for children? I'm going to have to say no. While I don't think that the Switch has more of an adult feel than, say, a console like the PlayStation 5 or the Xbox One, I do think that Nintendo has catered more to families. I think Nintendo is definitely more of a family-friendly console, and they've positioned themselves well enough to be enjoyed by children as well as adults. And I think when you look at the Switch 2, especially with some of the quality of life upgrades and some of those features, it's definitely going to be a console that adults can enjoy if it's the only console in your household. Now, if you're more of an adult gamer and you're someone who's hyper focused on performance, if you play certain games, that just feel and play better on a console like the PlayStation 5, or if there's certain Sony IPs that really appeal to you that you can't play on Nintendo, like certain Final Fantasy games, or like like I said, GTA 6, Grand Theft Auto. If some of those franchises that can only be played on PlayStation consoles appeal to you, then obviously you're going to gravitate more towards that, because there are adults who play video games who prefer hyper realistic games. They don't want to feel like they're running around with a cartoon character. They actually want to feel like they're immersed in the game. And hyper realistic games, I think, are going to become more and more popular. I think you're going to see this with a lot of racing games. You're going to see this with more open world adventure games. And the more we introduce AI into the mix, where AI is starting to kind of work in the background for some of these games, it's going to make these games a lot more immersive for adults. And I think you're going to see more adults driven towards this type of content. But what say you? Do you agree that the Switch is a child's console? Do you think it's more aimed at children? Or do you think Nintendo is just as adult as the other consoles that they're up against? I'm interested to know your thoughts here. Let me know down in the comments, and I'll catch you in the next video. It's the Y2K Collector. Take it easy.